Imagine you're standing in a vast, ancient library. The air is thick with the scent of old books, and the shelves stretch up to the ceiling, filled with countless volumes. You're looking for a specific book, but the more you search, the more you realize that the books are not arranged in any order you recognize. Some are old, some are new, and some are in languages you can't even identify. This is the world of 16th and 17th century Protestantism, a world where the past and the present are intertwined in ways that are both fascinating and confusing. In this era, the way people thought about religion, philosophy, and even the Bible itself was changing. But it wasn't just a clean break from the past. Instead, it was a complex dance of continuity and change, where old ideas were reinterpreted and new ideas were born. This complexity presents a major challenge for anyone trying to understand this period. For a long time, scholars thought they had it all figured out. They believed that the Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, was a clear break from the medieval world. They saw the Reformation as a clean slate, a fresh start. But as more research was done, it became clear that this was not the case. The Reformers didn't just throw out everything from the past. They reinterpreted it sometimes in subtle and nuanced ways. Take, for example, the way Protestant thinkers used the works of Thomas Aquinas, a medieval theologian. Some scholars thought that when Protestants talked about Thomism, they were directly reading Thomas's works. But it turns out that they were often reading Thomas through the eyes of other medieval thinkers like Johannes Capriolus or Cajetan. This means that what we think of as Thomist ideas in Protestant thought might not be exactly what Thomas himself believed. The same goes for other medieval thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. When we see Scotist or Ockhamist elements in Protestant thought, we need to ask whether these ideas came from direct reading of Scotus and Occam, or from the many Franciscan theologies that were popular in the late 15th and 16th centuries. This is a crucial question because it affects how we understand the development of Protestant thought. But the complexity doesn't stop there. The relationship between the Renaissance and the Reformation is another puzzle. For a long time, scholars thought that the Renaissance was all about humanism, a movement that focused on the study of classical texts and the revival of ancient Greek and Roman culture. They saw humanism as the opposite of scholasticism, the dominant method of teaching and thinking in medieval universities. However, recent research has shown that the relationship between humanism and scholasticism was much more nuanced. Many humanists were also deeply engaged with scholastic methods, and many scholastics incorporated humanistic elements into their work. This means that the lines between these two movements were much blurrier than we once thought. One of the most surprising developments in this field was the discovery of Calvinist Thomism. This idea, which emerged about 25 years ago, suggested that some Calvinist thinkers were heavily influenced by the works of Thomas Aquinas. This was a shock because it challenged the traditional view that Calvinism was a complete break from medieval scholasticism. It also opened up new avenues for research. As scholars began to explore the diverse backgrounds and influences of Reformed thinkers, the story doesn't end there. The 16th and 17th centuries were also a time of intense debate over the interpretation of the Bible. Older scholarship often assumed that post-Reformation exegesis was primarily dogmatic, meaning that it was focused on supporting established doctrines rather than understanding the text itself. But newer research has shown that this is not the case. Many Protestant thinkers of this era were deeply engaged with the literal and historical meaning of the Bible, and they developed sophisticated methods of textual criticism and philology. This brings us to another important point: the role of rhetoric and logic in the late 16th and 17th centuries. For a long time, these subjects were seen as separate from theology and philosophy. but recent scholarship has shown that they were deeply intertwined. Thinkers of this era used rhetorical and logical methods to structure their arguments, persuade their audiences, and defend their beliefs. This means that to fully understand the thought of this period, we need to look at the broader intellectual context, including the history of philosophy, rhetoric, and logic. As you navigate this complex world, you'll find that the boundaries between different fields of study are often blurred. The same thinkers who contributed to the development of Protestant theology were also involved in biblical exegesis, philosophy, and rhetoric. To truly understand their ideas, you need to look at their work from multiple angles and engage with a wide range of sources. In this book, we will explore these themes in depth, delving into the intricate web of ideas that shaped the 16th and 17th centuries. We will meet the thinkers who grappled with these questions and see how their ideas continue to influence us today. So as you step into this ancient library, be prepared to uncover the hidden connections and surprising insights that lie within its shelves. The way we look at the Reformation and the development of Protestant theology changes when we consider the methods of rhetoric and logic used by the Reformers and their followers. In the past, some scholars thought that Protestant scholasticism, with its heavy use of syllogistic logic, was very different from the more humanistic approaches of the early Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. However, this view is now seen as outdated. The truth is, the Renaissance, which came before the Reformation, had a big impact on both rhetoric and logic. Renaissance manuals on rhetoric often included lessons on syllogistic logic, and the logical methods used by 17th-century Protestant scholars can be traced back to these Renaissance developments. One key method that shows this continuity is the locus method. This method, developed in the 15th century by thinkers like Rudolf Agricola, was adapted by Philip Melanchthon for Protestant theology, and later refined by Roman Catholic theologian Melchior Cano. The locus method became a fundamental part of Protestant dogmatics, helping theologians move from biblical interpretation to a systematic and organized theology. This method was also closely tied to the classroom practice of disputation, which was a common way of teaching and debating in universities. After the Reformation, Protestantism became more than just a set of ideas. It became an institutionalized part of society. This process, known as confessionalization, involved the development and enforcement of religious standards in daily life. Social historians like Heinz Schilling have shown how Protestantism shaped the social and political fabric of communities in the later 16th century. This means that to understand Protestant orthodoxy, we can't just look at the ideas in isolation. We need to consider the broader social and political context. Older scholarship often made the mistake of treating Reformed theology as a rigid, deductive system based on a single central idea. This approach ignored the dynamic and evolving nature of Reformed thought, which was shaped by debates, cultural influences, and the practical needs of the Church. For example, the idea that John Calvin's theology was a complete and coherent system is a simplification. Calvin's ideas were part of a living tradition that continued to develop and adapt over time. The relationship between academic theology and popular religion is also important. In cities like Geneva, the work of the Company of Pastors and the Consistory, a church council, shows how theological debates affected everyday life. For instance, the controversy over predestination, involving a man named Jerome Bolsik, shows that even complex theological ideas could have practical implications for ordinary people. The consistory records reveal that while there wasn't much popular support for Bolsik, there was still concern about how predestination affected personal piety. To study Reformed theology effectively, we need to consider multiple contexts. For academic documents, we might focus on the traditions of theological and philosophical discourse. For sermons and popular tracts, we might look more at immediate social and political issues. The history of biblical interpretation can also help us understand the context of a particular text. This approach to studying Reformed theology is different from older methods that often ignored the historical context. It recognizes that the Reformation and the subsequent development of Protestant orthodoxy were deeply intertwined with the intellectual, social, and political life of the time. The Reformation didn't just produce a set of ideas, it produced a living tradition that continued to grow and adapt over the following centuries. Protestant scholasticism, far from being a rigid and lifeless system, was a dynamic and practical response to the challenges of the time. It helped define and defend the faith of the Reformed churches, ensuring that the achievements of the Reformation were not lost. Without this period of scholastic orthodoxy, the Reformation might have been just a brief and forgotten movement. Instead, it became the foundation of a lasting form of Christianity. In the 17th century, Reformed theology was shaped by both positive and negative influences. On the positive side, it drew on the best of medieval and Renaissance thought, incorporating exegetical insights, doctrinal formulations, and philosophical ideas. On the negative side, it continued to protest against the abuses and errors of the late Middle Ages and the Counter-Reformation. This combination of continuity and innovation is what makes Reformed orthodoxy a rich and complex part of Christian history. During the 17th century, Reformed orthodoxy faced many criticisms. Some said it was too rigid, dry, and lifeless. Others accused it of being overly speculative, metaphysical, and focused on predestination and legalism. Critics often claimed that Reformed orthodoxy was too influenced by Aristotle, and that it misused the Bible by taking verses out of context to support its ideas. However, when we look closely at the actual work of the Reformed theologians from this period, we find that these criticisms are often based on misunderstandings. One of the main sources of Reformed orthodoxy was the Bible. The 17th century was a time of great progress in biblical studies. Scholars like Buxtorf, Tremellius, and Junius worked hard to understand the original languages of the Bible and to produce accurate translations. For example, Theodore Beza, a student of John Calvin, wrote detailed annotations on the New Testament. He carefully examined different versions of the text and compared them to produce a more accurate translation. His work influenced the Geneva Bible, which became a key resource for Reformed believers. Another important figure was Andrew Willett. He developed a method called hexapla for studying the Bible. This method involved 6 steps: analyzing the text, comparing different translations, explaining difficult passages, identifying key doctrines, addressing theological debates, and applying the text to everyday life. Willett's approach shows that Reformed theologians did not just pick random Bible verses to support their ideas. Instead, they used a thorough and systematic method to understand the text and derive their teachings from it. Reformed orthodoxy also drew from the ancient creeds of the Christian Church, such as the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. These creeds helped define the core beliefs of the faith and provided a foundation for teaching and doctrine. For example, the Apostles' Creed was often used in catechism classes to teach the basics of the Christian faith. The Reformed churches also had their own confessions, such as the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession. These confessions outlined the specific beliefs of the Reformed tradition and often included statements condemning heresies and errors. The Church Fathers, such as Augustine and Chrysostom, were another important source. For Reformed theologians, these early Christian leaders wrote extensively on biblical and theological topics, and their works were highly respected. Reformed theologians studied the writings of the Fathers to understand the early Church's interpretation of Scripture and to ensure that their own teachings were in line with the broader Christian tradition. Reformed Orthodoxy also engaged with the broader theological tradition, including the works of medieval scholars and the Reformers themselves. While the Bible was the ultimate authority, Reformed theologians recognized the value of the insights and teachings that had been developed over the centuries. They saw their work as a continuation and refinement of the Christian tradition, not a complete departure from it. Finally, Reformed theologians did not ignore the role of reason and philosophy. They used logical and rhetorical methods to structure their arguments and to explain their beliefs. However, they were careful to ensure that reason and philosophy were always subordinate to Scripture. The goal was to use these tools to better understand and articulate the truths of the Bible, not to replace them with human wisdom. In the end, the Reformed orthodoxy of the 17th century was far more nuanced and rich than its critics often portrayed it. It was a theology that deeply engaged with the Bible, the ancient creeds, the Church Fathers, and the broader Christian tradition. It was not rigid or lifeless, but a living and dynamic system of belief that sought to understand and apply the teachings of Scripture in a thoughtful and systematic way. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Protestant theologians began to take a deep interest in the writings of the early Church Fathers. This interest wasn't just a passing fad. It was a serious, scholarly pursuit that led to the creation of new fields of study and the publication of many important works. One of the key figures in this movement was Johann Gerhard, a Lutheran theologian who coined the term patrology to describe the study of the Church Fathers. Gerhard's work was monumental, and he organized his study of the Fathers in a way that modern scholars still follow. He would start by giving a brief biography of a Church Father, list their works, and then analyze the content of those works. This method helped to systematically organize the vast amount of material available from the early Church. On the Reformed side, Abraham Scoltetus also made significant contributions with his work Medulla Theologiae Patrum. Both Gerhard and Scoltetus were part of a broader trend among Protestants to deeply engage with the writings of the Church Fathers. This engagement wasn't just academic. It was driven by a desire to understand and defend their faith against various challenges, particularly from the Roman Catholic Church and from heretical groups like the Socinians. The Socinians were a group that rejected many traditional Christian doctrines, including the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. In response, Reformed theologians like John Forbes and George Bull carefully analyzed the writings of the Church Fathers to show that their beliefs were in line with the early Church's teachings. This detailed analysis helped to solidify the Reformed understanding of key doctrines like the Trinity and Christology. However, this interest in the Church Fathers didn't mean that Protestants were simply copying the past. They still held that the Bible was the ultimate authority in matters of faith and practice. The Church Fathers were seen as valuable guides and teachers, but their writings were always to be measured against the Scriptures. This approach allowed Protestants to claim the best of the Christian tradition as their own, even as they rejected what they saw as the errors of the Roman Catholic Church. In the 17th century, Reformed theologians like Francis Turretin and Wilhelmus A. Brakel continued this tradition. They used the writings of the Church Fathers to defend their beliefs against various opponents, including the Socinians, Arians, and Arminians. They also drew on medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, integrating their insights into their own theological systems. For example, Franciscus Junius of Leyden wrote a major work on the foundations of theology, using categories from medieval scholasticism to explain key concepts. The Reformed also engaged with the philosophical ideas of their time, but they did so with caution. They were wary of adopting any philosophy wholesale, recognizing that reason and philosophy should serve theology rather than dictate it. They used logical and rhetorical arguments to defend their beliefs. often drawing on the works of medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. However, they were careful to ensure that these arguments stayed within the bounds of Christian doctrine. For instance, when faced with the idea of middle knowledge proposed by the Jesuits, Reformed theologians carefully examined the concept and rejected it as inconsistent with their understanding of God's sovereignty. They also engaged with the new philosophies of thinkers like Descartes and Spinoza, but they did so critically rejecting aspects that they saw as contradictory to their biblical and confessional norms. In their daily practice, Reformed theologians aimed to live out their faith in a way that was consistent with their beliefs. They saw systematic theology, not just as an academic exercise, but as a practical guide for living a Christian life. This meant that their theological work was always grounded in the real-world challenges and needs of the Church. Overall, the 17th century Reformed theologians were deeply engaged with the past, but they were also very much focused on the present and the future. They drew on the rich tradition of the Church to build a theology that was both firmly rooted in the Scriptures and responsive to the challenges of their time. In the world of Reformed Orthodox theology, the relationship between the formulation of doctrine and the life of the Church is deeply intertwined. The theologians of this era understood that theology wasn't just about abstract ideas. It was about real, practical guidance for the Christian life. They saw theology as a practical discipline, meaning that every doctrine had a purpose, to lead people to salvation and to shape their faith and daily living. For example, when theologians talked about God's attributes, they didn't just want to understand these attributes in isolation. They wanted to know how understanding God's attributes could help people live better, more faithful lives. This idea is reflected in the sermons of the Puritans and the works of theologians like Wilhelmus Brekel and Petrus van Mastricht. In their writings, you can see how each doctrine is connected to practical advice for living a Christian life. The Reformed Orthodox also believed that the success of their theology could be measured by its impact on the Church and individual believers. If a doctrine didn't help people grow in their faith or live more virtuously, it was considered flawed. This means that the practice of piety wasn't just a side note. It was a crucial part of how they evaluated their theological work. When it comes to the sources of Reformed Orthodox theology, the Bible was the primary and ultimate source. But theologians also drew from other important sources, like the Church's confessions, traditions, and even philosophy and logic. These sources were used to help interpret and apply the teachings of the Bible in a way that was relevant to the life of the Church. The way these theologians organized their work is also important. They used a method called the Loci method, which is like a structured way of organizing topics. Imagine a book where each chapter starts with a key topic, and then there are blank pages for notes. The Reformed Orthodox theologians did something similar. They had a set of standard topics, or loci, that they would study and write about. Each topic would start with a careful examination of relevant Bible passages, then move on to a discussion of the doctrine, and finally, address practical applications and refutations of errors. For instance, in Petrus van Maastricht's Theoretico-Practica Theologia, each topic follows a specific pattern. It begins with a biblical text, moves to a dogmatic discussion, then to a section where errors are refuted, and ends with practical advice. This approach ensures that the Bible remains the primary source, while also addressing the needs of the Church and individual believers. Similarly, Francis Turretin's Institutio Theologiae Ellentico is structured around theological questions. Turretin would start by identifying a problem, then provide a brief, positive definition of the Reformed view. He would then present a series of sources, starting with biblical texts and moving to rational and traditional materials. This method helps to show how different sources support the Reformed view and guide the reader back to the Bible. The Reformed Orthodox theologians also recognized different genres of theological work. For example, Maastricht identified four types: exegetical, focusing on Bible interpretation; dogmatic, focusing on doctrine; polemical, focusing on refuting errors; and practical, focusing on application. Turretin's work, for instance, is primarily polemical, meaning it focuses on refuting errors and defending the Reformed view. It's important to understand that the Reformed Orthodox didn't just copy the methods of the Middle Ages. They adapted and revised these methods to fit the needs of their time. This means that the content of their theology was not only based on the Bible and tradition, but was also influenced by the debates and challenges of their era. For example, the 30 Years' War affected Reformed eschatology, the study of the end times, and the rise of Socinianism led to more historical examinations of the Church Fathers. In the end, the Reformed Orthodox theologians were deeply committed to creating a theology that was both grounded in the Bible and relevant to the life of the Church. Their methods and sources reflect this commitment, showing that theology is not just about abstract ideas, but about real practical guidance for living a faithful Christian life. The study of Reformed theology in the 17th century has evolved significantly over the years. Early scholars often focused narrowly on theological systems and dogmatic tracts, overlooking the broader intellectual and spiritual landscape of the time. As research has progressed, it has become clear that to truly understand the thought of 17th-century theologians, we need to look at a wider range of sources and contexts. For example, the theologians of this period were not just scholars, but also pastors and spiritual advisors. They engaged in various aspects of church life, from preaching and catechizing to writing and teaching. One notable figure is Gisbertus Voetius, a prominent Dutch theologian who was not only a brilliant academic but also a dedicated pastor. Voetius's work shows how the boundaries between academic theology, biblical exegesis, and pastoral care were much less rigid in the 17th century than they are today. To understand the theology of this era, we must also consider the relationship between philosophy and theology. Historians of church and theology have often focused on dogmatic issues, while historians of philosophy have concentrated on major philosophical movements. This division has led to an oversight of the profound interconnections between the two disciplines. For instance, the methods used in 17th-century theology, such as the locus method, reflect a blend of Renaissance logic and rhetoric with scholastic traditions. This method was crucial in moving academic theology from classroom exercises to written texts, much like how the Quaestio functioned in the Middle Ages. The locus method helps us see how theologians of the 17th century integrated various sources, including the Bible and the works of the Church Fathers, into their formulations. This method emphasizes the relationship between the theological result and its sources, showing that the development of Reformed orthodoxy was not based on a single central dogma, but on a complex interplay of ideas and traditions. When we look at the history of Reformed theology, we see different approaches that have shaped our understanding. One early approach focused on the development of predestination as a central dogma, with scholars like Alexander, Pfizer, Heinrich Heppe, and Paul Althaus arguing for a high degree of continuity between the Reformers and later Reformed theologians. However, this view was often colored by theological biases and assumptions. Another approach, which emerged in the mid-20th century, pitted Calvin against the Calvinists, arguing that later Reformed theology represented a departure from Calvin's original teachings. This perspective was influenced by neo-Orthodox theology, which viewed scholasticism negatively and emphasized the distinction between law and gospel. More recent scholarship has challenged these earlier views, emphasizing the continuity and complexity of Reformed thought. Scholars like Willem van Asselt Richard A. Muller, and Carl Trueman, have argued that Reformed orthodoxy is not a rigid predestinarian system, but a dynamic and multifaceted tradition. They have also highlighted the importance of the medieval background and the need to study Reformed theologians in their historical and intellectual contexts. In the end, the study of Reformed theology in the 17th century requires a nuanced and Feijersen approach. By examining the methods, sources, and contexts of the theologians of this period, we can gain a deeper and more accurate understanding of their thought. This approach not only enriches our knowledge of the past, but also helps us appreciate the complexity and richness of the Reformed tradition. The debate over John Calvin and the Calvinists has been a long and complex one. Some scholars argue that there was a significant difference between Calvin's original teachings and those of his followers, particularly Theodore Beza. This view suggests that Beza and others of his generation introduced a more rigid scholastic form of predestinarianism, which diverged from Calvin's more nuanced and balanced approach. However, this perspective still assumes that predestination was a central concept in Calvin's thought, and that Calvin himself laid the groundwork for a monergistic, God-centered, and monopleuric, one-sided view of the covenant, which emphasized God's sovereignty over human responsibility. Scholars like Trenchard, Moeller, McCoy, and Baker have contributed to this line of argument. They highlight how Calvin's emphasis on predestination led to a theology that downplayed the role of human responsibility and the historicity of salvation, which are central to covenant theology. This view sees the development of covenant theology as a response to the predestinarian tendencies in Reformed thought. Some argue that covenant language became a way to reintroduce a sense of human responsibility and the historical unfolding of God's plan, while others see it as a move toward a more legalistic framework. Another group of scholars, including Kickel, Hall, Torrance, Rolston, Grindler, Poole, Holtrop, and Slydrecht, takes a different approach. They draw on 19th-century scholarship and a neo-orthodox perspective to argue that there were significant disjunctions between Calvin and later Reformed theology. These scholars often portray Calvin as a precursor to neo-orthodox Christocentrism, emphasizing the importance of Christ in Calvin's theology, while depicting the later Reformed Orthodox teachings as rigid and theologically problematic. For example, Kickel sees Beza as the primary figure, who introduced a problematic predestinarianism and a rationalistic scholasticism into Reformed thought. Brian Armstrong's work on Calvinism and the Amiraut heresy is particularly influential in defining Protestant scholasticism. He outlines 4 key characteristics of this phenomenon: a deductive approach to religious truth based on logical reasoning, a high regard for reason in theology, a belief in the unified and rationally comprehensible nature of Scripture, and a strong interest in metaphysical and speculative thought, especially concerning the nature of God. Armstrong also contrasts French humanism with Protestant scholasticism, suggesting that these were 2 fundamentally different orientations. However, this dichotomy has been criticized for oversimplifying the relationship between humanism and scholasticism and for not fully accounting for the historical context. Some scholars, like Holtrop, push this distinction further, arguing that there was an internal conflict within Calvin's own thought between humanistic and scholastic elements. This perspective is problematic because it relies on a definition of scholasticism that does not fit the scholastic qualities found in Calvin's work, and because it oversimplifies the historical context. The idea that predestination served as the central principle from which the entire Reformed scholastic system was deduced is another key aspect of this debate. Scholars like Kickel, Hall, McCoy, and Kendall argue that Beza and the Reformed Orthodox began their theologies with the decree of predestination and developed their doctrines deductively. This view sees the emphasis on predestination as leading to a theology that is less focused on Christ and more focused on abstract rationalistic concepts. However, this perspective has been challenged by more recent scholarship. Scholars like Bray, Donnelly, McPhee, McClelland, Anderson, Letham, and Van Spieger have begun to reassess the relationship between the Reformation and the subsequent era of Protestant orthodoxy. They argue that the older definitions of scholasticism and the central dogma theory need to be revised. For example, Bray questions the idea that Calvin was the primary influence on later Reformed theology and challenges the notion that predestination was used deductively as a central dogma. Donnelly emphasizes the continuity of scholastic method in the positive use of Aristotelian philosophy during the Reformation era. Van Spieger, in particular, highlights the presence of scholastic elements among the Reformers and points to continuities with later Reformed theology. These scholars are moving away from the older, more polemical approaches and toward a more nuanced understanding of the development of Reformed thought. In this context, it's important to recognize that the contemporary understanding of Calvin against the Calvinists is based on several misapprehensions. The older scholarship often had its own theological biases, such as Schweizer's desire to connect Reformed doctrine with Schleiermacher's project, or Weber's argument for the superiority of Lutheran dogmatics. The neo-Orthodox context of much contemporary scholarship has also influenced how Calvin and the Reformed Orthodox are interpreted. The creation of a rift between the Reformation and Orthodoxy has been necessary for the neo-Orthodox appropriation of Reformed theology, but this has often led to oversimplifications and caricatures of both Calvin and his successors. As we wrap up this exploration, it's important to understand that the story of the Reformation and its aftermath is far more complex and interconnected than it might seem at first glance. For a long time, historians and theologians have often painted a picture of the Reformation as a clean break from the past, especially from the medieval period. They've also often portrayed the reformers, like John Calvin, as being starkly different from the theologians who came after them, the so-called Calvinists or Protestant scholastics. However, recent scholarship has shown us that this picture is too simple. Instead, the Reformation and the period that followed it are deeply rooted in the intellectual and theological traditions of the Middle Ages. This means that the reformers, including Calvin, didn't just throw out everything from the past. They built on it, modified it, and sometimes even criticized it. But they didn't start from scratch. For example, many of the theological ideas and methods used by the reformers, like Calvin, had their roots in medieval scholasticism. Scholasticism was a way of thinking and teaching that was very systematic and relied heavily on logic and argument. It wasn't just a medieval thing. It continued to evolve and change through the 16th and 17th centuries. So, when we see Protestant theologians using scholastic methods, it's not a sign that they were moving away from the Reformation. Instead, it shows that they were continuing a tradition that the reformers themselves had already been part of. Another important point is that the terms scholasticism and Aristotelianism are not static. They didn't just stop evolving after the Middle Ages. In fact, the way these terms were understood and used changed a lot during the Reformation and the post-Reformation period. For instance, the study of Aristotle's works, which was a big part of scholasticism, continued to develop and change. Thinkers like Francisco Suarez in the late 16th century and others in the 17th century were still working with and modifying Aristotelian ideas. Moreover, the relationship between humanism and scholasticism is more nuanced than it might seem. Humanism was a movement that emphasized the study of classical texts and the importance of rhetoric and language, but it wasn't always at odds with scholasticism. Many humanists, like Philip Melanchthon, were also deeply involved in scholastic methods and used them in their theological work. This shows that the two movements were not always in conflict, and could coexist and influence each other. When we look at the development of Protestant orthodoxy, we see that it wasn't just about preserving the ideas of the Reformers. It was also about adapting and expanding those ideas to address new challenges and questions. This is why we see a lot of diversity in post-Reformation theology. Different theologians had different ways of thinking about the same issues, and they often drew on a wide range of sources, including medieval scholasticism, Renaissance humanism, and even patristic theology, the theology of the early Church Fathers. One of the key things to remember is that the Reformation and the period that followed it were not just about breaking with the past. They were also about building on it and creating something new. The Reformers and the theologians who came after them were part of a continuous tradition of Christian thought that stretched back to the early Church. They were trying to understand and apply the teachings of the Bible and the traditions of the Church in a way that was relevant to their own time. In the end, the story of the Reformation and post-Reformation theology is one of continuity and change, of building on the past, while also moving forward. It's a story that shows us the richness and complexity of Christian thought and the ongoing dialogue between different generations of thinkers. By understanding this, we can appreciate the Reformation and its legacy in a deeper and more meaningful way.